still wet on the napkin when Richard Blackstone's hand froze halfway to his mouth. 4 words, scrawled in desperate handwriting. "Your daughter is here." The $800 Wagyu steak sat untouched as Richard's world tilted sideways. He had no daughter. His wife died in childbirth 16 years ago, along with what he thought was his only child. Or so he'd been told. The black waitress who'd slipped him the note was already walking away, her shoulders rigid with tension that seemed to vibrate through the entire dining room of Charleston's most exclusive restaurant, the Augustine House. Richard Blackstone didn't become a billionaire by ignoring details that didn't add up. And something about tonight, the anonymous reservation, the specific table by the kitchen doors, the way this waitress moved like someone carrying the weight of a secret, felt orchestrated. Before we go deeper, hit that subscribe button. This story isn't just about a note. It's about buried truths, generational sins, and what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. Because what Richard didn't know was that the note wasn't a revelation. It was a warning. Richard Blackstone controlled a fortune worth $4.3 billion, built from the ruins of his family's collapsed textile empire. At 52, he was the kind of man whose entrance into a room shifted gravitational fields. CEOs straightened their ties. Politicians rehearsed talking points, and in Charleston's elite circles, his approval was currency more valuable than gold. Tonight he'd come to the Augustine House undercover. No entourage, no Armani suit, just designer jeans and a plain black sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He'd received an anonymous letter 3 days ago, typed on actual paper, delivered by courier to his Manhattan penthouse. "The truth about your daughter lives in Charleston. Come alone to the Augustine House on Friday, order the porterhouse, and listen." Richard Blackstone didn't respond to anonymous letters, but this one had included a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, of a teenage girl who had his late wife's eyes. Catherine's eyes, the same unusual amber green that had made him fall in love 20 years ago. He'd hired 3 private investigators who'd confirmed what his heart refused to accept. The girl was real. Her name was Aaliyah Mitchell. She lived in North Charleston with a woman named Tamara Mitchell, and according to DNA databases he had no legal right to access, but paid 7 figures to infiltrate. She was his biological daughter. But Catherine had died in childbirth. The baby, a boy they'd told him, had died too. Richard had mourned them both, drowned himself in work for 3 years, and eventually built an empire on the foundation of that grief. Someone had lied to him, and after 16 years, someone was ready to tell him why. The Augustine House wasn't just exclusive, it was a fortress of old Charleston money where black folk traditionally entered through the back door or not at all. But the owner, Helena Cunningham, had recently hired a diverse staff after a discrimination lawsuit threatened her liquor license. Which is how Tamara Mitchell ended up serving tables to the same people whose ancestors had owned hers. At 38, Tamara had the kind of tired beauty that came from raising a child alone while working 3 jobs. She'd been a labor and delivery nurse at Charleston Memorial before her nursing license was suspended under circumstances she never discussed. Now she scraped by on tips and desperation, watching her daughter Aaliyah grow into a young woman who asked too many questions about a father who supposedly died before she was born. When Tamara saw Richard Blackstone walk through the restaurant's front door, her heart stopped. She'd known this day would come eventually, had prepared for it even, but nothing could have readied her for the physical reality of seeing the man whose life she'd helped destroy 16 years ago. She smoothed her white shirt, the standard-issue uniform that made her, the black waitstaff, look like she'd stepped out of an antebellum fantasy, and approached his table with the practiced smile of someone who'd learned to make themselves invisible to survive. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Augustine House. Can I start you with something to drink?" Richard looked up, and for a microsecond, something flickered across his face. Not recognition exactly, but a sense of importance he couldn't quite place. "Macallan 30, he said. "Neat." Tamara nodded and turned away, her hands trembling as she walked to the bar. The bartender, a young white guy named Derek who thought casual racism was charming, smirked as she approached. "Your section's really moving up in the world, Tamara. That's Richard Blackstone. You know, the billionaire?" He said it like she wouldn't know, like her world was too small to contain information about men who moved markets with phone calls. She didn't respond, just waited for the whiskey and carried it back on a silver tray that reflected her face in warped metal. Richard accepted the drink without looking at her, his eyes scanning the menu with the focus of someone evaluating a business acquisition. "I'll have the porterhouse, medium rare, and make sure your chef understands that medium rare doesn't mean medium." "Yes, sir." She turned to leave, but something made her stop. Maybe it was the weight of 16 years of secrets. Maybe it was the memory of Catherine's screams in that delivery room. Maybe it was just pure exhaustion from carrying truths that weren't hers to hold. Tamara pulled the folded napkin from her apron pocket, the one she'd prepared 3 days ago when the anonymous letter had been delivered to her apartment, the one that promised her $100,000 if she did exactly as instructed. She placed it under Richard's water glass so subtly that even the security cameras wouldn't catch the exchange, and walked away without looking back. Richard didn't notice the napkin immediately. He was too focused on the restaurant's layout, mapping exit points and sight lines like he was planning a military operation. When you had his kind of money, paranoia wasn't a disorder. It was a survival mechanism. He sipped the Macallan, let its smoky warmth settle in his chest, and reached for his water glass. That's when he saw it. The napkin was folded in half, the words visible through the thin fabric. "Your daughter is here." His hand froze. His carefully constructed composure, the armor that had protected him through hostile takeovers and board coups, cracked like ice under sudden weight. He unfolded the napkin with fingers that trembled despite his best efforts to control them. "Your daughter is here. Aaliyah Mitchell. She's working in the kitchen tonight. The woman who delivered her 16 years ago is serving your table. Everything you were told was a lie. Your wife didn't die in childbirth. She was murdered. And the people responsible are in this room right now. Someone who owes you the truth." Richard's vision blurred. The restaurant noise, the clinking silverware, the pretentious conversations about wine pairings and vacation homes faded into white noise that sounded like screaming. He stood up so abruptly, his chair scraped against the floor, drawing annoyed glances from nearby tables. His hands gripped the napkin like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly gone liquid. The black waitress, Tamara, according to her name tag, stood near the kitchen doors, her back to him, her shoulders tense with the posture of someone expecting confrontation. Richard crossed the dining room in 5 long strides, social niceties forgotten, his billion-dollar empire reduced to ashes in the face of a truth he hadn't known he was looking for. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The note. Explain. Now." Tamara turned slowly, her face a mask of controlled terror and something else. Determination, maybe, or resignation. "Not here," she whispered. "Meet me in the back parking lot in 20 minutes. Come alone. And Mr. Blackstone?" Her voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry. For everything that happened. For everything I did." Before he could respond, she disappeared through the kitchen doors, leaving him standing in the middle of Charleston's most exclusive restaurant, holding a napkin that had just destroyed everything he thought he knew about his life. Meanwhile, Aaliyah Mitchell scraped burnt risotto off an industrial skillet, her arms aching from 4 hours of back kitchen labor that paid $8.50 an hour under the table because she was 16, and Helena Cunningham didn't believe in labor laws that cut into profit margins. She was small for her age, all sharp angles and nervous energy, with amber-green eyes that seemed too old for her face. Kids at school called her weird quiet, the kind of teenager who read philosophy books during lunch and wrote poetry in margins of textbooks she couldn't afford to buy. Her mother, Tamara, had raised her on love and secrets in equal measure. Aaliyah knew the basics. Her father had died before she was born, her mother had quit nursing under complicated circumstances, and money was always tight, even though Tamara worked jobs that left her hands raw and her spirit exhausted. What Aaliyah didn't know, what Tamara had hidden behind smiles and bill collectors, was that her entire life had been built on a foundation of lies that were about to crumble. "Aaliyah!" Chef Andre's voice cut through the kitchen chaos like a cleaver. He was a short, angry Frenchman who'd failed up from food trucks to this prestigious kitchen, where he ruled with the tyranny of someone compensating for his own inadequacy. "The Blackstone table steak, expedite." Aaliyah moved to the pass, where a perfectly cooked porterhouse sat under warming lights, its juices pooling in ways that made her stomach growl with hunger she'd learned to ignore. She didn't know that the man who'd ordered this steak was her father. She didn't know that in approximately 18 minutes, her entire world would implode with revelations that couldn't be unlearned. She didn't know that her mother was in the back parking lot, preparing to confess sins that had haunted her for 16 years. All Aaliyah knew was that her hands were shaking as she garnished the plate, that her mother had looked terrified when she'd arrived for her shift, and that something in the air felt wrong. The kind of wrong that preceded earthquakes and other disasters you couldn't prepare for. "Stop daydreaming and move!" Andre barked, and Aaliyah carried the plate through the kitchen doors into the dining room, where her father sat staring at a napkin like it contained the secrets of the universe. Their eyes met for half a second, amber green recognizing amber green, and something passed between them that neither could name, but both felt in their chests like the toll of a bell that had been silent for 16 years. Then Aaliyah was past him, delivering the plate to table 14, where a CEO and his mistress pretended to discuss quarterly earnings while playing footsie under white tablecloths. Richard watched her walk away, and in that brief glance, he saw Catherine, not as she'd been in the hospital, pale and struggling, but as she'd been on their first date, laughing at his nervous jokes and stealing fries from his plate. This girl was his daughter. He knew it with the same certainty he knew gravity existed, and death was inevitable. The question wasn't whether the note was telling the truth. The question was who had lied to him 16 years ago, and why, and how many people had conspired to steal the one thing his money couldn't buy: his family. The back parking lot of the Augustine house smelled like grease traps and broken dreams. Tamara stood under a flickering fluorescent light, her white shirt stained with coffee and shame, waiting for the man whose life she'd helped destroy. Richard appeared from the shadows like an avenging angel, his face carved from rage and grief in equal measure. "Talk," he commanded. "Now, before I call the police and have you arrested for—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "For whatever crime this is." Tamara's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. She'd practiced this confession 1,000 times in mirrors and nightmares. "My name is Tamara Mitchell. 16 years ago, I was the head labor and delivery nurse at Charleston Memorial Hospital. Your wife, Catherine, came in for an emergency C-section. There were complications. Severe bleeding, elevated blood pressure. She needed an immediate transfusion." Richard's jaw clenched. "I was there, I remember. They wouldn't let me in the delivery room. They said it was protocol." "It wasn't protocol, Mr. Blackstone. They kept you out because of what they were planning. Tamara's eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall. Your wife's doctor, Dr. Stephen Harrison, was being paid by your business partner, Marcus Cunningham, Helena's father. The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Marcus Cunningham had been his mentor, the man who'd helped him rebuild his family's fortune after his father's death. They'd been partners for 8 years before Marcus died of a heart attack in 2014. Marcus wanted your company, Tamara continued, her voice hollow. He'd been systematically positioning himself to take control, but he needed you distracted, broken. So he paid Harrison to tell you that your wife and baby had died during delivery. That's impossible, Richard whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. I saw the death certificates. He stopped, memory flooding back. Marcus handled all the paperwork. He said it was too painful for me to deal with the details. Tamara nodded. Catherine did die, Mr. Blackstone. But not in childbirth. She died 2 days later from complications that could have been prevented if Harrison had provided proper post-delivery care. He let her bleed out slowly, documenting it as unavoidable tragedy. And my daughter? Richard's voice was barely audible. Aaliyah survived, a healthy baby girl. But Harrison told you she'd died too. He falsified records, paid off staff, and gave her to me to raise as my own. Tamara's mask finally cracked, tears streaming down her face. I was drowning in student loans. My nursing license was conditional. Harrison offered me $50,000 and a clean record if I took the baby and disappeared. You took money to steal my child? Richard's rage was cold, controlled, more terrifying than if he'd screamed. I took money to survive. Tamara's voice broke. I was 22 years old, $200,000 in debt, and they threatened to destroy my career if I didn't cooperate. So yes, I took your daughter. And I loved her. I raised her. I gave her everything I could with the guilt eating me alive every single day for 16 years. Richard stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Where's the proof? Why should I believe you? Tamara pulled a manila envelope from inside her shirt. Because 3 days ago, someone delivered this to my apartment. Someone who knows everything. She handed him the envelope. Inside were medical records, real ones, not the falsified versions Richard had been shown. Catherine's actual cause of death. Postpartum hemorrhage, preventable with proper care. A birth certificate for Aaliyah Rose Blackstone, signed by Dr. Harrison and dated 2 days after the official death certificates. Bank statements showing payments from Harrison's offshore accounts to Tamara's student loan servicers. And photographs, dozens of them, of Marcus Cunningham meeting with Harrison in locations that suggested conspiracy rather than legitimate medical consultation. But the most damning evidence was a voice recording on a USB drive. Richard plugged it into his phone with shaking hands. Marcus Cunningham's voice filled the parking lot. Catherine Blackstone is a liability. Her medical history makes her perfect. Harrison will handle the complications. Richard will be too destroyed to fight the paperwork. And by the time he recovers, I'll have controlling interest in Blackstone Holdings. The baby goes to the nurse. Richard never knows. Clean, simple, permanent. Another voice responded. Helena Cunningham, 16 years younger but unmistakably her. And if someone talks? If the nurse gets a conscience? Marcus laughed. Then she has an accident, but she won't. She's bought and paid for just like Harrison. Some people's dignity comes with a price tag, Helena. You'd be surprised how cheap most people's souls really are. Richard's phone slipped from his fingers, clattering on the asphalt. His knees buckled, and only Tamara's quick reflexes kept him from collapsing completely. I'm sorry, she whispered, supporting the weight of a billionaire who'd just discovered his entire adult life was built on murder and theft. I'm so sorry. Where did this recording come from? Richard's voice was hollow. I don't know. The envelope had no return address, but whoever sent it wanted you to know the truth. Tamara paused. Mr. Blackstone, there's more. Helena Cunningham owns this restaurant. She's been tracking Aaliyah's movements for months. I think she's planning something. As if summoned by her name, a black Mercedes pulled into the parking lot, its headlights illuminating the two figures standing under the flickering fluorescent light. Helena Cunningham stepped out of the car, and she wasn't alone. She had inherited her father's cruelty, but refined it with a feminine touch that made it more palatable to Charleston's elite. At 48, she commanded her restaurant empire with the same ruthless efficiency Marcus had used to nearly steal Richard's company. She'd known this confrontation was coming ever since she'd sent the anonymous letter to Richard's penthouse. She hadn't orchestrated everything. She'd nudged the pieces she could control and gambled the rest, the reservation, the napkin, even ensuring Tamara would be working tonight, because Helena understood something her father never had. The best revenge wasn't stealing someone's fortune. It was making them watch as you destroyed everything they'd built to replace what you'd taken. Richard, she purred, stepping into the light. Behind her, 3 men emerged from the Mercedes. Private security, judging by their professional stance and expensive suits. You're creating a scene in my parking lot. How uncouth. Richard straightened, and Tamara felt the shift in his energy, from broken man to apex predator in the space of a heartbeat. Helena, his voice was ice, we need to talk about your father's business practices. She laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. Ancient history, Richard. Daddy's been dead for 12 years. Whatever sins he committed died with him. Except they didn't. Richard held up his phone, the voice recording still cued. I have evidence that Marcus Cunningham conspired with Dr. Stephen Harrison to murder my wife and steal my daughter. And you were part of it. Helena's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind her eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or fear dressed up as confidence. That recording is inadmissible, darling. No chain of custody, no authentication, and even if it were real, statute of limitations expired years ago. You're a brilliant businessman, Richard, but a terrible prosecutor. I'm not interested in prosecution, Richard said quietly. I'm interested in destruction. That's when Aaliyah emerged from the restaurant's back door, her shift ended, her mother's car keys in hand. She froze when she saw the standoff, her mother's terrified face, the stranger who'd stared at her in the dining room, and Helena Cunningham, who'd always made Aaliyah's skin crawl whenever she came through the kitchen. Mom? Aaliyah's voice was small, uncertain. What's happening? Richard turned, and for the second time that night, father and daughter locked eyes. This time, recognition wasn't instant. It was seismic, the kind of knowing that rewrote history and revealed futures that should have been. Aaliyah, Tamara said, her voice breaking. Baby, there's something I need to tell you about your father. He's dead, Aaliyah replied automatically, the script she'd learned by heart. You told me he died before I was born. I lied. Tamara's face crumpled. I lied about everything. Aaliyah, this is Richard Blackstone, your father. He's been alive this whole time. I took you from him when you were 2 days old because I was paid to, because I was too weak to do the right thing. The parking lot fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and the hum of the fluorescent light that had witnessed this family's destruction, and now its potential resurrection. Aaliyah looked at Richard, then at her mother, then at Helena Cunningham, whose smile had frozen into something predatory and cruel. You knew, Aaliyah said to Helena, her voice gaining strength. All those times you came through the kitchen, asking me questions about my family, about my mother's nursing career. You were checking on us, making sure we stayed quiet. Helena's mask slipped completely. Clever girl, just like your mother. Too clever for your own good. One of her security guards shifted position, his hand moving toward the inside of his jacket in a gesture that made Richard's protective instincts flare like gasoline on fire. "Don't!" Richard commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd negotiated with warlords and senators. "Don't make this worse than it already is." "Worse?" Helena laughed again, but this time it sounded unhinged. "Richard, you don't understand. This isn't about secrets coming out. This is about Aaliyah understanding her value." She turned to face the teenager directly. "Your father is worth $4.3 billion, and as his only biological heir, you're entitled to half of everything if something unfortunate were to happen to him, like a heart attack, or a car accident, or a random act of violence in a parking lot." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. "You're insane," Tamara breathed. "I'm practical," Helena corrected. "Daddy tried to steal Richard's company. He failed. But he taught me something important. Patience. For 16 years, I've waited for the right moment to finish what he started. And that moment is now." Her security guard's hand moved faster than anyone expected. But Richard had spent years in boardrooms with people who wanted him dead. He recognized the pre-violence micro-expressions that separated armed posturing from actual intent. He dove forward, tackling Aaliyah to the ground as the first shot rang out. What Helena hadn't accounted for in her calculated revenge was that Tamara Mitchell, former labor and delivery nurse and current waitress who'd spent 16 years preparing for this exact moment, had called 911 approximately 90 seconds into the parking lot confrontation. Charleston PD arrived in force. 5 squad cars, lights blazing, sirens cutting through the night like avenging angels. The security guard with the gun found himself face down on the asphalt within seconds, his weapon confiscated, his wrists cuffed with satisfying efficiency. Helena's other 2 guards wisely chose surrender over resistance. And Helena Cunningham, architect of 16 years of suffering and freshly attempted murder, discovered that money couldn't buy everything, especially not immunity from consequences captured on the Augustin House's parking lot security cameras. Richard stood slowly, checking Aaliyah for injuries with hands that shook from adrenaline and paternal instinct he'd never been allowed to express. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice rough. Aaliyah stared at him. This stranger who was her father, this billionaire who'd just taken a bullet meant for her, and nodded shakily. "I think so. That was—" She stopped, her teenage brain struggling to process attempted murder and family revelation in the same 15-minute window. This is really messed up. Despite everything, the trauma, the guns, the 16 years of stolen time, Richard laughed. It was a broken sound, but genuine. "Yeah, kid, it really is." The police processed the scene with professional efficiency. Detective Lisa Crawford, a 20-year veteran who'd seen Charleston's darkest corners, took statements from witnesses who'd heard the commotion and emerged from the restaurant, smartphones recording what would become the most viral attempted murder video in Charleston history. Helena tried her usual routine. Family name, political connections, high-powered lawyers, but cell phone footage of her security guard drawing a weapon and firing at unarmed civilians had a way of making privilege evaporate. "Helena Cunningham," Detective Crawford said, with satisfaction she didn't bother hiding. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and about 6 other charges we'll add once our DA gets creative." As Helena was led away in handcuffs, her perfect mask finally shattered completely. "This isn't over, Richard," she screamed. "You can't prove anything about Daddy. The statute of limitations—" "I don't need to prove anything about your father," Richard interrupted quietly. "What you did tonight, on camera, in front of witnesses, that's plenty." The ambulance arrived to check Aaliyah and Tamara for shock. Richard rode with them, his hand never leaving his daughter's shoulder, as if physical contact could compensate for 16 years of absence. In the ambulance's fluorescent interior, with EMTs checking vital signs and police radios crackling with updates, Aaliyah finally asked the question that mattered most. "Why didn't you look for me, all these years?" Richard's face crumpled. "I thought you were dead. They showed me death certificates, your mother's, and yours, for a baby boy who supposedly died during delivery. I mourned you both for 3 years. Then I buried that grief under work because it was the only way to survive." "But you kept my name," Aaliyah said, reading his expression. "Blackstone. That's my real last name, isn't it? Not Mitchell." "Aaliyah Rose Blackstone," Richard confirmed, his voice breaking. "Your mother wanted to name you after her grandmother and my mother. She picked it out when we found out she was pregnant. She was so excited to meet you." Tears streamed down Aaliyah's face, for the mother she'd never known, for the father she'd been denied, for the 16 years they'd all lost to other people's greed. Tamara sat in the corner of the ambulance, her own tears mixing with guilt that would take years to process. She'd saved Aaliyah by confessing, but she'd also stolen 16 years that could never be recovered. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, the words inadequate but sincere. "Richard, I'm so sorry." Richard looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since the parking lot revelation. He saw a woman who'd made terrible choices under impossible circumstances. A woman who'd loved his daughter when he couldn't. A woman whose conscience had finally outweighed her fear. "You kept her safe," he said finally. "You raised her when I couldn't. That doesn't absolve you of the theft, but—" He paused, searching for truth. "But it means something. Thank you for keeping her alive." The EMT cleared them both, bruised but not broken, traumatized but surviving. Detective Crawford met them at the hospital entrance with updates. "Helena Cunningham's security guard is cooperating. Turns out being hired for murder carries mandatory minimums he's not interested in serving. He's already giving up everything. The timeline, the planning, Helena's explicit instructions to ensure Aaliyah inherited, and then—" She paused delicately. "Eliminate both heirs." "She wanted to kill us both?" Aaliyah's voice was hollow. "Insurance policies pay out to remaining family if something happens to direct heirs," Detective Crawford explained gently. "Helena was counting on intestacy laws to direct Blackstone Holdings assets to extended family, namely her as your father's former business partner's daughter, if both of you were dead. It was elaborate and stupid, which is usually how these things go." Richard's phone buzzed with notifications. His lawyers, his board members, journalists who'd somehow already picked up the story. But he ignored all of it, his attention focused entirely on the teenage daughter he'd just discovered, and almost lost in the same night. "What happens now?" Aaliyah asked, her voice small. "Now," Richard said, "we figure out what kind of relationship we can build from this disaster, if you want one. I know I'm a stranger. I know I have no right to expect—" "I want one," Aaliyah interrupted. "A relationship. With you. I mean, you literally took a bullet for me, and we just met. That's—" She laughed wetly. "That's pretty good dad material." It was broken and messy, and nothing like the family reunions Hollywood sold as possible. But it was real, and for the first time in 16 years, it was theirs. 6 months later, the courtroom was full for Helena Cunningham's sentencing. She pled guilty to attempted murder and conspiracy, trading her freedom for testimony that reopened her father's buried crimes and exposed the doctors who helped him erase the truth. Judge Dorothy Reynolds didn't soften her words. "You didn't just attempt murder," she said. "You stole 16 years from a family and corrupted the trust meant to protect life. 25 years. No parole for 15. Helena's fortune was seized. Her restaurants shuttered. The settlements couldn't repair the damage, but they acknowledged it. Tamara Mitchell sat in the gallery, her nursing license reinstated after investigators confirmed she'd been coerced. She never returned to labor and delivery. Instead, she worked at a trauma recovery center, helping others survive systems that nearly destroyed them. Aaliyah and her mother were rebuilding, slowly, painfully, learning how to be family without lies. Therapy twice a week. Truth, even when it hurt. Richard cut his work life in half. Boardrooms gave way to dinners. Silence gave way to questions. Together, he and Aaliyah were building something new, careful not to mistake wealth for safety again. He founded the Catherine Blackstone Foundation to investigate medical malpractice and protect families who couldn't fight alone. Its first initiative exposed patterns hospitals had spent decades burying. Charleston Memorial settled for $47 million. Licenses were revoked. Administrators fired. The silence cracked. The Augustine House was sold. Its name erased. In its place stood the Blackstone Center. Free meals, legal aid, real help. Every Saturday, Aaliyah volunteered there. One evening, as they cleaned tables side by side, Richard asked, "How do you feel?" She thought for a moment. "Like I'm finally where I belong." Outside, Charleston's old money looked away. Inside, something stronger was growing. Not power, not revenge, truth. 6 months earlier, 4 words had started it all. Your daughter is here. Now Aaliyah understood the rest. Family isn't what you're told. It's what you fight for. And justice isn't about punishment. It's about making sure the truth survives. If this story reminded you that truth always finds its way to light, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment about families you've witnessed reunited against all odds. And share this story with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late for justice, for healing, for the truth.